Hello, this is Jean Marie Ward, reporting for BuzzyMultimedia.com. With us today is Mary Robinette Kowal, the award-winning author of Shades of Milk and Honey and Vice President of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. Welcome to Washington.
Thank you so much.
Okay. I've heard it said that people who write wonderful short stories seldom write good novels, and vice versa. The skills are too different. That's obviously not true in your case. I've read some of your short stories and they're wonderful, and so is your novel. Congratulations on the Nebula nomination, by the way.
Thank you.
What's the secret to doing both well?
Well, I have heard the same thing, and I actually don't think it's true. I think that they do use the same skills. The difference, I think, is in what you are attracted to. Stories that lend themselves well to the novel form are not stories that lend themselves well to the short form. And what happens, I think, is that someone who likes novel-length works, when they try to fit a story into that constrained format, are choosing works that just won't fit into the short form. So I think that the fundamental level is the kind of fiction that you're attracted to, and understanding that in a short form you have a much more constrained palette. You have to have fewer characters, fewer plot points, fewer scenic locations. But otherwise, on a line-by-line, scene-by-scene basis, and in terms of overall narrative arc, I think that both of them employ the same skill sets. It's just how large a palette you're dealing with.
You chose to deal with a much larger palette for your novel, Shades of Milk and Honey. For our viewers who don't know, it's set in a world almost identical to the English Regency, only with magic. What attracted you to that period and its mores? Because it's definitely a novel of manners.
Yes. I have long been a fan of Jane Austen. I sometimes say that I learned more about writing horror and suspense from Jane Austen than from anything else, because what she's good at is the tiny detail and the importance of that tiny detail. So I was reading Persuasion by Jane Austen and had just finished reading a giant epic fantasy, and I was so caught up in Persuasion, and I thought, why can't fantasy have these intimate dramas? Because there's so many things that can go wrong in someone's life besides, you know, evil overlord or life, you know, life-threatening situations. So I thought, well, I would like to read that novel, so I sat down to write it. The thing that is appealing about that period is how specific the expectations of society are. They are almost like rules of magic in some ways. You know, it's like what order you go into the table, and if that order is violated, that means something huge. And so there's that aspect of it that appeals to me. Plus, I think the clothes are pretty.
You are not afraid of costume. I like that in a writer. I understand you did a fabulous costume for the Nebula Awards.
Yes. All right, thank you. But yes, I did go in costume, and I went back and forth because, you know, the tendency is for people to think, well, writers are serious and they should not do costume because they have to be separate from fandom. But I'm like, but we are fans. Let's be honest. And I write this partly because I like the pretty clothes. So so as a research project, I decided to see whether or not I could hand stitch a dress.
Oh God.
So that dress was entirely hand sewn. It was cream figured silk. I did cheat and use a trim rather than doing hand embroidery along the edges. But I did do some hand embroidery in other places, some hand beading. And I think that was a really good learning exercise. But one of the reasons I'm attracted to these things is that I come out of a theater background. So, you know, costume and dressing up just seems natural.
Yeah, which segues into my next question. How does your background as a performer and as a master puppeteer figure into your fiction and your writing work? And obviously this is part of it.
Well, there's a couple of different ways. One is that I spent 20 years in puppet theater, And the thing that does...
You were a child when you started.
Thank you. I'm 42. So no. I mean, I started in high school, but I realized pretty quickly that if people were going to give me money to work with puppets, that I was willing to take that money. And as I say with writing science fiction, thank God I have puppetry to fall back on. But one of the biggest gifts that gave me, there are two, and one of the biggest ones is an understanding of audience. Because when you spend that much time performing a show and getting audience feedback and seeing the tiny, tiny changes and how large an effect a tiny change can have in an audience, it gives you a much better understanding, I think, of storytelling and pacing. So that's one gift, and that's something that I was able to translate. The other gift that I got from puppetry is an approach to character. In puppetry, we say there are 4 principles, and once you understand the principles, you can apply them to any style of puppet. But after that point, it just becomes, no different than figuring out which way to turn the faucet when you're in a new bathroom. So the 4 principles are focus, which indicates thought; breath, which indicates motion; muscle, which is the idea that the puppet is moving itself; and meaningful movement, which means that since the puppet has very limited facial expression, the body language becomes very important, so every movement should have a meaning. And just as one example, because I don't want to bore you, focus, which indicates thought, translates directly into fiction. As a writer, I can show my audience member one thing at a time, and I have to rely on them to build that picture in their head. So the order in which I show things to them becomes very important. The other thing is that by choosing the items, I'm telling the reader what my character is thinking about. For instance, if 2 people walk into the same room, one of them will notice the crooked painting on the wall, and the other one will notice the stick of butter on the counter. And it depends on who the person is and what's important to them. So making those choices, by choosing what my character focuses on, I can demonstrate what they're thinking about.
Absolutely, and I would think that motion would be very important in terms of, because too often people, tell versus show.
Mm-hmm.
He felt sad as opposed to his whole body slumped at her rejection. And that, I think, is one of those 4 principles you were talking about.
Absolutely. With meaningful movement, we have, in puppetry, there are basically, you have aggressive, passive, and regressive motion. And again, I'm not going to get into the entire lecture, but aggressive motion is anything that you're interested in. So these can be things you're curious about, things that you're happy about, some forms of anger. But we do it naturally, where you lean in. And passive is what it sounds like. Regressive are things that you aren't interested in. Leaning back, exactly. Things that repulse you, things that frighten you, things that you're just disinterested in. The fanboy you can't get away from. Those are all things we unconsciously lean back from or turn away from. So when, and I will give you a tell, when you are reading my fiction, you will notice that that my characters will sometimes lean in or walk towards or turn towards, and that is me using the body language of puppetry. I actually have to watch it because I can't overuse that, but it is something that I find myself doing all the time, using that aggressive, passive, and regressive motion on the page.
Great. It's good stuff for writers, and we're more of a general interest fantasy site, but the writers in our audience are going to be nuts on that. Really, it's great. Has it been hard to balance being a puppeteer, being a writer, with being the vice president of SFWA?
Yes and no. One of the advantages of coming out of 20 years in theater is that I've been a freelancer. So my life has been juggling a lot of different projects. And in many ways, SFWA and writing and puppetry are all just different freelance gigs, and so it's just figuring out which deadline comes up first. I like to say that I run my life by structured procrastination.
I like that idea. What's next on your writing and performing horizons? I understand that there is a sequel to Shades of Milk and Honey coming out soon?
That's true. In winter of 2012, I don't have the exact release date, Glamour and Glass, which is the sequel to Shades of Milk and Honey, will come out. And that is basically one of the characters, not surprisingly, gets married at the end of Shades of Milk and Honey. Two of the characters, obviously, for matrimony. But the interesting thing about the year that I set the book is it's 1814. Napoleon goes into exile in 1814, which is not important in Shades of Milk and Honey. But in 1815, the following year, and this is history, so it does not count as a spoiler, Napoleon comes out of exile. So if one, say, happens to go to the continent for a honeymoon,
boom.
Yes, there's this little war called Waterloo.
Just a small blip on the radar there.
Just a small blip. And say, you know, someone happens to go to Belgium for their honeymoon because they think Paris is too dangerous, and oh, that's where Waterloo is. What could possibly go wrong? So Glamour and Glass is a little more swashbuckling than Shades of Milk and Honey. Both books are designed to stand alone, but it obviously helps if you've read both of them. So that is the next book. There's the first chapter is in the trade paperback of Shades of Milk and Honey, which comes out on June 7th.
Congratulations on
Thank
that. One question about that. Since I know production cycles, I know you've already turned in this book. What are you working on now?
What am I working on now? I am working on a new novel called The Transfigured Lady. It is in a completely different universe. It's set in 1907, Nashville, Tennessee. My main character is a young African-American actress who is using magic to pass as white. To say that there are a lot of different ways the novel could go horribly wrong as a writer would be an understatement. I spent a year researching it and continue to research it while I'm working on this, and working with a lot of people to try and walk that line there's just a lot of different things to juggle in this book. But it's basically magic, interracial romance, murder, and vaudeville.
I like it already. Where can anything you'd like to add?
Anything I would like to add. I just had a novella come out in Asimov's that I'm very happy about.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It was the first time I had a cover story on Asimov's, and that was
very cool.
Yes, since this is one of the magazines that I read. I cannot remember when I got the first issue because I have read it that long, and having my story be the cover story, the amount of squee, it's like, Sheila told me this, and it was via email, so my actual reaction was, oh my God! And then I was like, thank you, Sheila, that sounds very lovely.
What you can't see on this tight shot is that she immediately went to type. Thank you, Sheila. That's so wonderful. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
That's great. And the question I started to ask before I stumbled into the right one was, where can your fans find you on the net?
You can string out my entire long name, MaryRobinetteKowal.com. The easier one that does not require so much spelling is shadesofmilkandhoney.com, which takes you to exactly the same website.
Great. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.